If you end up liking this video and finding it helpful, then give it a thumbs up and leave your comments below about what your experiences are of using this video. And also, if you haven't already, click the subscribe button and the bell button near the subscribe button so that you can be kept informed when future videos like this go live.
So this is an adult bedtime story that will also help to increase your creativity. So take a moment to close your eyes and allow yourself to begin to relax. And as you begin to relax, you can listen to the sound of my voice in the background. And while I talk to you in the background, so you can relax in your own unique way. And just allow yourself to drift comfortably asleep to this story. And as you drift comfortably asleep to this story, so the story I tell will begin to lay down certain patterns in the brain. It'll begin to activate certain neurological patterns in the brain that will help you increase creativity in your daily life, in your work life, in the different contexts that you would like to increase creativity in. So as you listen to this story, at some point you'll just drift comfortably asleep. And that's okay, you're unconscious. We'll continue listening and absorbing the useful patterns from the story. So there was a man who lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and he lived in a little shack on the edge of some woodland. And every day this man would leave his shack, go out into the woods, chop some wood, take it back to his shack for a fire, leave his shack again, go out into the woods, forage for some berries, for some plants to eat, and he'd take them back to his shack. And then as the day continues on, he would go out of his shack again, and he'd go hunting for something to eat. And then he'd go back to his shack. And then he'd spend some time sitting outside the front of his shack as the early evening approached, just relaxing, gazing over the lake near his shack. And he had a very peaceful existence. He was just alone, enjoying life. He had his routines. Every day he woke up, every day he did the same things in the same order. Every day he ended by sitting and gazing out over the lake and relaxing before going and starting a fire and cooking himself some food. And then after eating, he would clean up and snuggle up in bed and comfortably fall asleep. And every day as the sun rose, he would wake up again and repeat the same thing over and over again. And he was comfortable with this. He didn't really question it at all. He was comfortable to wake up every day, to do the same thing every day, and to go to bed every day in the same way, knowing he's going to wake up again and do the same thing all over again. And there'd be subtle changes to his routine, but not much. So as the seasons changed, from spring to summer, to autumn to winter, and back to spring again, as the seasons changed, so he would have to wear slightly different clothes, so some tasks would be more difficult, so some tasks he wouldn't be able to complete, and he'd have to make do with what he's got. And as the seasons changed, so the sun would rise and set at different times. But he had his routines, and he was relaxed with that. He didn't know any different. And sometimes when he'd go out and catch some food, he would go to the lake instead and catch some fish. Other times when he'd catch some food, he'd go into the woods and perhaps catch a rabbit or catch another animal to make part of his food. But his routine was pretty standard. He could tell you what he was doing today, tomorrow, next year. Then one year, spring came round, and it hadn't rained for months. And the flowers that normally came up in spring didn't come up. The insects that normally came up in spring didn't come up. He saw less ducks. He saw fewer other animals. And then as spring went on, the rain still didn't arrive. And he could see the water in the lake beginning to go down. And to start with, he didn't think much of it. He thought everything will just turn out fine. But then, as time went on, he noticed that actually something was different this year. The rain isn't coming. The water's drying up. And so he decided to go outside his comfort zone a bit. He decided to grab himself some clothes, make himself a bag, spend a day getting as much food as he could, and then going out on a journey. He knew that he'd be going so far, he won't be returning to the shack tonight. He didn't know entirely what he was going to find, what his journey was going to consist of. But he knew that he had to make this journey. He had to be comfortable with uncertainty for a moment. He had to trust himself. And so he walked down to the lake's edge. He could see the crusty mud where water usually is, and he walked along the lake's edge, and he followed that lake's edge all the way down to the stream that feeds the lake. And he noticed that the stream was dry, and he walked along the dry stream until he came to the river that feeds the stream. And he noticed that this river was largely dried up. There was about as much water in the river as there normally is in the stream. And as the sun began to set and the moon began to rise and clouds of stars began to stretch across the sky, with the occasional fizzing meteor trailing across the sky, and a cool breeze on his skin, he set up camp. Just a very basic camp, just something to tuck himself out of the elements a little. He lit a fire and he cooked a little bit of food and ate that food by the fire. And then as he fell asleep, he just let his mind drift off asleep to the crackling sound of the fire burning down, to the crackling sound of the fire just turning to embers, just warming and radiating that warmth. And then he woke up the next morning, covered over the fire with some mud, and carried on his journey, following the river. And as he continued following the river, he noticed that there was still just a trickle of water, that the river was running, but it was running very slow. And there wasn't much there. He didn't know quite what he was going to do, where he was going to go. He just knew he had to find out what was going on and find a way of getting enough food to eat, and as he followed the river, he left the bit of land that he'd known his whole life. He ventured beyond as far as he had ever gone. As the river turned towards the mountains, and he continued to follow that river up towards the mountains. And he walked, he could feel the warmth of the sun on his body, the weight of a bag on his back. He could hear the sounds of crickets in the tall grass. And the rustling leaves while the wind blows a breeze. Then he noticed the river broke into a fork, and he had to decide whether to go left or right. He knew ultimately both routes would probably lead where he needs to go, but he didn't know which would be the best route to take. He knew he could take the left route, which could be right, leaving the right one left. Or he could take the left route. So he could take the left route or the right route. But he didn't want to take the wrong route. And he thought to himself, well, the right route right there would leave that one left. And the right route might be right, or it could be wrong. And if it's wrong, then that route left there that's left was actually right. And I should have taken that right route and have this one left. And he thought to himself, well, it's his right to decide which route is left and which route is the right route to take. And he decided, you know what, left or right, one is right and one is incorrect. It doesn't really matter. If he makes a mistake, he'll just go with uncertainty and just take whatever happens and go with it and figure something out. So he decided to turn left onto the left route, deciding that's probably right, leaving the right route left right over there, in the other direction, walking further away from it. Reaching that point where he looked back and thought, well, you know, I've left too far from there now. There's no turning back. This is the right choice to make. And he followed this path. He followed this route of the river up towards the mountains. And currently the river still was just a trickle. He didn't know if it was all just a trickle because there'd been no rain for months, or if perhaps something was blocking some of the water, or maybe even diverting it somehow. And he wondered how far the no rain had gone as he followed this river. And after 2 more days and 2 more nights of following the river, of every day just waking up and walking, and then setting up camp and sleeping, and then waking up and walking, and then setting up camp and sleeping. After 2 days of that, he arrived at the foot of the mountain. and he could see the waterfall meandering down this side of the mountain into the river, and it appeared to be no more than a trickle. And yet up high he could see ice. He could see that the mountains had snow on them. So he knew there was some water there. And he thought to himself, well, if it got hotter, the water would melt. And if the water melted, then the water would flow down the mountain and into the rivers. And he decided to climb the mountain a little bit. So he started climbing. And it was easy at first. He could just walk up, following a path probably left by thousands of different animals using it over hundreds of years. And he worked his way up the mountain. And then he reached a part where he's going to have to climb up the rock face to get up to the next level on the mountain. He's going to have to climb up alongside a waterfall. And it was reasonably dry. It wasn't much of a waterfall. And so he pinned himself close to that mountain. And almost like Spider-Man, he stretched up his legs and his arms and started to climb. And he could feel the warmth in his arms from his muscles working hard to climb. And he had to work out where to place each foot, where to place each hand. And after a struggle and a lot of sweat, he made it up the side of the waterfall and allowed himself to lie down flat on his front. Exhausted, he then took off his bag and rolled onto his back to catch his breath. And he lay on his back for a while, taking some deep and comfortable breaths, breathing in and breathing out, letting all that air out, breathing in and breathing out. And after a few comfortable breaths, he decided here would be a good place just to set up for the night, to camp for the night, before continuing his journey. And during the night, he heard a noise outside his little tent. He knew that it was the sound of a couple of wolves, maybe thinking that he's prey and that he's easy picking. They're not used to seeing someone this far out. And they'd be sniffing around, trying to figure out what's inside the tent and whether to enter or not. There was no front to the tent, there was just the fire, which was now just glowing embers in front of the tent. And so the man closed his eyes for a moment and he imagined himself outside the tent. He imagined what did that environment look like out there. He focused on hearing the wolves, hearing their footsteps, hearing their breathing, and built up a mental picture of where they are, how they're moving around his tent. And what he thinks is likely to happen. And in his mind's eye, he pictured the different routes he could take, the different things he could do. And so he took some time doing this before deciding that the best thing to do was to scare the wolves off, to let them know that he's not someone to be messed with and that it's not worth their trouble. And so he ran out the tent, grabbed a stick with some embers on it, and ran screaming and waving it towards the wolves. The wolves panicked and scarpered and ran off in different directions and squealed. And the man knew that they wouldn't be back, that they wouldn't understand or know what just took place, but they'd know that it's something unknown and scary to them. And so they'd leave him alone. And in the morning, he awoke, having slept well during the night. And he knew today he'd work his way up the last bit of the mountain to where he was heading for. He was trying to head for where this river began. And he knew that the water flows down the mountain, and that it starts off as many trickles and it all feeds into one river, which gets wider and wider, but for some reason it's not this year. And he wondered whether it was a lack of the rain. And when he reached where he was heading, he saw that at the top of the mountain was a lake. And this lake was largely frozen over. But some of the water in the lake seeped through the mountainside and seeped out and started its journey down. And the man thought to himself he could hack away at the mountain and empty more of the water into the river. But then he thought, all that's doing is speeding up the problem, that all that water would run down the mountain, and then as long as there's no rain and the weather's too hot, it would all just disappear. At least up here in the mountain where it's cold, that water is held in place, and every night when it gets even colder, more water settles on the surface in the form of snow and frost, and forming ice on things. So the man decided that what would be best for now would be to figure out how to survive here while they wait for rain through the valley. And he knew that he could warm up some of the snow to make some drinking water. He could cook with that water. There was a few animals living up here as well, animals he'd never seen before, animals that were the colour of the snow. He knew that as long as he's the only one up here, he could find enough food. There's a few hardy plants and he could figure out how to make it work. And so for a few months he figured out how to make it work up here in the mountain, using the ice for fresh drinking water, using the ice and snow for cooking and for cleaning, catching all these new animals and having to figure out how to catch these new animals. And how to catch the occasional bird that flew over and landed to have a drink. And after a few months, the rains came to the valley, and he watched from up here on the mountain. He watched the clouds rolling in. It had been so hot and dry. He watched the clouds rolling in and a thunderstorm rolling in. He watched the thunder start. Lightning striking, trees catching fire. Sheets of rain so dense you could barely see through them. And for 3 days and 3 nights he watched as rain pummeled the valley, and the river swelled and overflowed, and water flooded the valley, the water flooded the river, flooded down the streams. And off in the distance he could see that it looked like the lakes were filling with water, because he could start to notice in breaks in the cloud, sunlight shining off the water, where before there was nothing reflective there. The trees started going from brown leaves to green leaves. Life sprung into action. After 3 days and 3 nights, when there was a day of sunshine, insects suddenly appeared buzzing around and scurrying around. And it was like all life knew how to take the opportunity, how to take the moment when it needed to. And the man decided he could go back to his hut. He could go back to that shack, live there again. But he got accustomed to the idea of exploring, of finding creative ways to survive. So he decided to head back down into the forest, find his way through the forest, and wherever he wanted, just pitch up, take some time for himself, perhaps spend a few days, because he just likes that spot, and then have them as memories, and he'd make it work, and enjoy the journey, not knowing where the destination will be, just enjoying the journey, finding creative solutions, finding creative ways to overcome problems he didn't even know he was going to face. Different ways of doing things, different ways of looking at things, different uses for things. And then after a while, for the first time in most of his life, he met another person. And shared some of his experiences with them, and created new experiences with them. And every day he just enjoyed the most perfect night's sleep.